She was soaked to the skin, hugging her son right in the pouring rain. Passers-by turned away, but the soldier and his dog stopped. What happened next revealed a promise that no one was supposed to remember. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning had been heavy from the start, the kind of humid, close air that hung like soaked fabric before a summer storm. The sky above Memphis had turned a tired gray, bruised with darker swirls, and the scent of rain had settled early into the cracked sidewalks and brick alleys. In the quiet southern neighborhood on the edge of the city, the streets were nearly empty, save for the steady rhythm of a man's footsteps and the softer tap of paws beside him. Caleb Walker ran not for fitness or pleasure, but out of ritual. Each morning, just after dawn, he and Zeus, the pale-furred Labrador who had been his shadow since the end of his last deployment, took to the streets. Caleb had never quite returned from Afghanistan, not entirely. Something of him had stayed behind with the sand and the silence and the men who didn't make it home. The parts that did return had learned to keep moving, if not forward, then at least away from people, noise, and memory. At 32, Caleb was still lean and wiry, his limbs conditioned by discipline rather than vanity. His dark skin gleamed with sweat under his gray sleeveless hoodie, and every muscle in his frame moved with economy, like a man always ready for something to go wrong. Zeus, running in perfect time beside him, was quieter than most dogs. His coat was a pale gold brushed with silver on the ears, his eyes intelligent, his gait confident. He wasn't just a companion. He was trained, attentive, and, in many ways, the only soul Caleb trusted anymore. The neighborhood they ran through was neither wealthy nor run down, one of those forgettable edges of the city where chain-link fences tried to hold back overgrown lawns and storm drains swallowed the stories of the poor and the invisible. Caleb knew these streets well. He stuck to this route for its emptiness and anonymity. The fewer eyes on him, the better. That morning, thunder began to growl as they passed the old freight bridge near the highway junction. It was an ugly thing, slabs of concrete and rusted beams scrawled with graffiti and decades of neglect. Caleb glanced up at the sky, already darkening into an angry sheet of cloud. The first drops of rain hit his skin like cold fingers, and within seconds the drizzle turned into a downpour. He tugged his hood up and kept running, used to Memphis weather turning on a dime, but Zeus, normally unfazed by storms, suddenly slowed. The dog's head lifted, nose twitching into the wind, his ears flicked back. Caleb noticed immediately. Zeus didn't spook easily. "What is it?" he muttered under his breath, slowing his pace. Zeus had stopped altogether, his body rigid, his attention fixed on something ahead. No, not ahead, off to the side, under the bridge. Caleb followed his gaze. It took him a moment to make out the shapes in the rain. At first, they looked like debris, another pile of junk dumped by someone in a rush. But then the movement registered, a huddled form, small and still. A child. Next to it, a woman sat with her back to the wall, shielding the child with her body. Her clothes clung to her frame, soaked and stained. One arm curled tightly around the boy's shoulders. They didn't seem to notice the rain anymore, or perhaps they had stopped caring. Zeus let out a low whine and took a step forward. "Hold on," Caleb said quickly, reaching for the leash instinctively, though Zeus was already trained to stay close. Still, the dog strained slightly, as though pulled by something more than instinct, something deeper. Caleb stepped off the sidewalk, shoes sinking slightly into the muddy embankment leading toward the underpass. The rain drummed harder now, echoing against the concrete above them. He approached slowly, hands visible, posture low and non-threatening. He had been trained to de-escalate, to approach carefully, even when he didn't know what the danger was. The woman looked up. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. Blonde hair clung to her cheeks and her lips were chapped and colorless. She didn't speak, just stared, as if uncertain whether he was real or not. The boy, about 8 by Caleb's guess, leaned against her side, his eyes half closed. Not asleep, not in this weather, just shut down. A child who had seen too much. "Hey," Caleb said, voice low and clear. "You all right?" No response. The woman blinked slowly, then looked away again. He took a step closer, gauging her reaction. She didn't move, didn't even flinch. That told him everything. Exhaustion, fear, maybe even shame, but no fight left in her. Zeus trotted forward, stopping just shy of the boy. The dog tilted his head, then moved with deliberate care. He approached the woman, stopping in front of her knees, and gently nudged his nose under her limp hand. Caleb saw her hand twitch. Then, as if on instinct, she let her fingers fall into the dog's head. Zeus leaned in. Slowly, he lowered his head and rested his chin directly in her palm. Caleb frowned. That wasn't normal. Zeus didn't seek contact like that with strangers, not unless... His memory stirred. A vague, half-buried image. He didn't chase it. Not yet. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked. Still no answer. The woman finally looked at him again, and now he saw something else behind her silence, a weariness so deep it seemed to crush her bones. She shook her head just once. Caleb took a breath, exhaled slowly. "Come with me." She blinked again as if not understanding. "I've got a dry place. You and the boy. You can rest. Warm up." She looked at him, hesitant. Her eyes dropped to Zeus, who remained motionless, a quiet sentinel at her side. "You trust him," she said hoarsely, barely audible over the rain. Caleb nodded. "He hasn't been wrong yet." The woman looked at her son. The boy didn't look back. He was pale, shivering, eyes blank. She gathered him carefully into her arms and stood, wincing as she straightened her back. Caleb stepped forward and took a soaked duffel bag from beside them. The walk back was slow and silent. Rain soaked through their clothes, and puddles collected in their shoes. Caleb walked slightly ahead, leading the way, while Zeus stayed close to the boy, occasionally glancing back as if to make sure they were still following. By the time they reached Caleb's street, the worst of the storm had passed, but the clouds hung low and angry. His small rental house stood quietly between 2 overgrown lots. He unlocked the door and stepped aside. "Inside," he said gently. The woman hesitated only for a second, then crossed the threshold with her son. Zeus followed without a sound. Caleb shut the door behind them. The rain continued outside, drumming on the roof like distant footsteps, but inside was quiet, still, and dry. He had no idea who she was. He didn't ask why she was under that bridge, or how she ended up there with a child and a few tattered bags. All he knew was that Zeus had stopped. And Zeus never stopped without a reason. That alone was enough to change everything. Inside the modest house, the air smelled faintly of cedarwood and rain. The living room was simple but tidy, a space built more for function than comfort. A thin, worn rug lay across the wooden floor, and a small electric heater hummed quietly in the corner. There was no television, no clutter. Only a single photo frame on the mantelpiece and a thick blanket folded neatly on the arm of the couch hinted that someone truly lived here. For Caleb, who preferred silence to noise and solitude to company, this house had been sanctuary. But now it was something else. A fragile shelter extended to strangers, led here not by obligation, but by the silent insistence of a dog's intuition. The woman stood just inside the doorway, holding the boy tightly, dripping rainwater onto the hardwood. Her clothes clung to her like a second skin, and her eyes scanned the room with wary calculation. She didn't seem frightened, exactly, more like someone who had been let down too many times to trust even kindness when it appeared. Her son, still wordless and trembling, leaned into her side, his small face pale and wet, hair plastered against his forehead. Caleb gestured toward the couch. "Sit. You're safe here." The woman hesitated, eyes flicking briefly to the front door, then to Zeus, who stood nearby with quiet vigilance. She finally stepped forward, lowering the boy onto the couch with care. His limbs moved sluggishly, not from injury, but from exhaustion, the kind that settled deep in the bones. Caleb disappeared down the hall and returned a moment later with towels and 2 large flannel shirts, his own, worn and soft from countless washes. "You can change in the bathroom down the hall," he said, holding them out. "There's a dryer in the back room. Toss your clothes in there when you're done." She took the towels but said nothing. The boy watched him cautiously but didn't speak. Zeus approached and sat quietly beside the child, earning a faint flicker of interest from the boy. "My name's Caleb," he offered gently, crouching to the boy's level. "And that's Zeus. He doesn't bite unless you're a squirrel or a liar." A small, barely there twitch of the lips came and went on the boy's face, too brief to be called a smile, but enough to show he'd heard. The woman returned from the hallway a few minutes later in the oversized shirt, towel wrapped around her damp hair. Her expression remained guarded, but something in her posture had softened, just slightly. "I'm Rachel," she said, voice hoarse from disuse. "This is Evan." Caleb nodded, his face unreadable. "You hungry?" Rachel opened her mouth as if to protest, then closed it again. Pride warred with necessity. She gave a faint nod. Caleb turned to the small kitchen space and opened a can of soup, setting it to heat on the stove. The scent of broth and carrots soon filled the room. Zeus lay down by Evan's feet, head resting on his paws. Evan reached out tentatively and let his fingers trail through the dog's thick fur. Zeus remained perfectly still, offering comfort without demand. While the soup warmed, Caleb moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency. It wasn't much, just 2 bowls of lentil and vegetable stew with slices of toasted bread, but it was warm, and it was something. He handed 1 bowl to Rachel and set the other on the coffee table in front of Evan. The boy blinked at it, then began to eat slowly, spoon by spoon, as if unsure it was real. They ate mostly in silence. Rachel sat on the edge of the couch, bowl in hand, posture still tense but no longer rigid. Caleb didn't press with questions. He knew enough to wait. When the meal was finished, Evan curled into the far corner of the couch, and before long, drifted into sleep beneath the borrowed blanket. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, a muted thrum that filled the room like background music. Rachel watched her son sleep, her eyes tracing the curve of his small shoulders, the flutter of lashes on pale skin. She looked older in that moment, not in years, but in weight. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb nodded once. "You don't owe me anything." She looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. Still, most people would have walked right by. He didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in the single armchair across from her, elbows on his knees, gaze distant. "I've done enough walking by," he said quietly. Rachel looked at him, uncertain how to respond. There was a long pause before she spoke again. We've been moving for months, she said, couch to couch, motel to shelter, then nothing. My sister cut contact when I asked for help. Said she had her own kids to worry about. Everyone else just looked at me like I was the mess, not the one who got left with one. Her voice cracked slightly. She swallowed it down. Caleb didn't interrupt. He had heard enough similar stories in different forms. Soldiers abandoned by the system, families torn by grief, people discarded when they became inconvenient. He'd lived pieces of that story himself. I had a job, she continued, part-time, diner work, and then Evan got sick. Nothing serious, just a fever, but I missed too many shifts, and when I came back, they'd given my spot to someone else. Rent fell behind. My brother said he'd help. She trailed off. Caleb watched her closely now, sensing the tightening in her jaw. He did help at first, paid the landlord for a couple months. Then he said he could take over the money from Evan's father's policy, said it'd be easier, less for me to deal with, that I could just focus on Evan. I trusted him. Her hands clenched tighter. I shouldn't have. Caleb leaned forward, his voice low but calm. What happened? Rachel let out a slow breath. He transferred everything, said he'd set up a trust, but the statements stopped coming. He stopped answering calls. I tried to ask, tried to get help, but no one listens to someone who looks like they live out of a car. I had no proof. Nothing with my name on it. And I was too ashamed to go back to anyone Evan's father served with. I didn't want them to know that I'd failed him. Her eyes brimmed, but she blinked the tears away stubbornly. He died overseas, saving lives, and I couldn't even keep our son off the street. There was silence in the room. Even the rain seemed to quiet for a moment, as if giving space to her words. Caleb stood slowly and walked to the fireplace. On the mantel sat the single-framed photo in the house, 3 young men in uniform, laughing, arms slung over each other's shoulders. One of them had Rachel's eyes. He picked up the frame and turned it toward her. Was his name Ben? Rachel's breath caught. She stared at the picture as if it had struck her. She stood, moved closer, took the frame in shaking hands. Yes, she whispered. That's him. Caleb nodded, jaw tightening. He was my brother in arms, my medic partner. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. For a moment she just stood there, stunned, the frame trembling in her grip. Then her knees buckled and she sank onto the floor in front of the hearth, the picture held against her chest. Zeus got up and padded over to her. Without hesitation, he nudged her hand again, then rested his head in her lap, just as he had beneath the bridge. Rachel bent over, burying her face in the dog's neck, and let the sob escape at last. Caleb watched in silence, his hands clenched at his sides. All this time, he had wondered what his friend had left behind. And now, that grief had a face. 2 of them, in fact, one curled on the couch in exhaustion, the other crumpled on his floor in heartbreak. He moved to the kitchen, poured 2 glasses of water, and set one beside her on the floor. Then he returned to the chair, watching the dog offer more comfort than any words could. When she looked up again, her eyes were rimmed red but clear. I don't know what to do, she said. I've got nothing left. He died so Evan could have a chance, and I let that chance get stolen. Caleb met her gaze with quiet resolve. Then we get it back. And in that moment, though neither of them realized it yet, a new chapter began, not just for Rachel and Evan, but for Caleb too. The weight of memory had brought them together, but it was the living that would give them a reason to move forward. Morning broke quietly, without fanfare. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving behind a landscape rinsed clean. Drops still clung to the edges of window panes, and the streets outside Caleb's house glistened with residual damp. Inside, the air was still, as if even the walls were holding their breath, unsure of what would come next. Caleb stood by the kitchen counter, sipping from a chipped white mug, black coffee steaming in his grip. He was watching them, Rachel and Evan, without truly meaning to. They had fallen asleep on the couch the night before, huddled beneath the thick blanket he kept for winter. Zeus lay curled at Evan's feet like a sentinel, his ears twitching once in a while, but his breathing even and calm. It was the most peace Caleb had seen in this house since he moved in. Rachel stirred first. Her eyes fluttered open with the wary snap of someone unused to safety. She blinked once, then sat up slowly, disentangling her limbs from the folds of the blanket. Her eyes met Caleb's across the room. He didn't look away. "Didn't mean to fall asleep," she said, her voice still husky with sleep. Caleb shook his head. "You needed it." Rachel brushed her fingers through her tangled hair, looking down at her son, who remained fast asleep, one hand flung across Zeus's back. The sight made her chest tighten. Caleb set his coffee down and moved to the small table near the window. "I made toast. It's not fancy, but it's warm." She nodded, pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and came to sit opposite him. The toast was already buttered, the butter half melted into the grain. She took a bite. It tasted like something real, something grounding. There was a moment's quiet as they ate. Caleb let her come to the words herself. "Last night," she said slowly, "when you showed me that photo, I didn't know what to say. I still don't." "You don't have to say anything," Caleb replied. "But I want to. I didn't know that you served with Ben." Caleb's fingers tightened around his coffee mug. "He was one of the best. Brave, stubborn as hell. The kind of guy who would patch you up while yelling at you for getting shot in the first place." Rachel's lips curved into something that resembled a smile. "That sounds like him." "We were medics together, different units for a while, but ended up on the same rotation our last deployment. Got real close those last 7 months." He paused, gaze drifting to the window. "We had plans. After the service. He talked about you and the baby all the time. Said he couldn't wait to get home, be a dad for real." Rachel looked down at her hands. "He never got that chance," she said softly. "One minute he was there, and the next, it was just a folded flag and a knock at the door." Caleb nodded slowly, his jaw clenched. "We were ambushed on the return from a field clinic. He pushed me down behind the vehicle. Took the hit standing up." Her breath caught. "I didn't know that." "I didn't think you did." There was silence between them, but it wasn't cold. It was the heavy kind, full of grief that had waited too long to be shared. Rachel looked at him, eyes shining. "He saved you." Caleb nodded. "And I haven't stopped asking why." Zeus rose from the couch and padded over, as if drawn by the weight of memory. He nudged Caleb's leg with his nose, then moved to Rachel and sat by her chair. Without thinking, she let her hand drop onto his head. "I always thought Ben's dog would have grown old by now," she murmured, running her fingers gently through Zeus's fur. Caleb looked at her sharply. "Ben's dog?" She nodded. "Yeah. He said he'd gotten a pup during his last leave before deployment. Trained it to do this trick." She broke off, then lifted Zeus's head gently with both hands. He relaxed, letting his chin rest in her palm, eyes half closing. "This." He said it was his favorite thing. how the pup would just melt like this into your hand. He taught it when the dog was a few months old. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the image in front of him. Zeus, calmly pressing into Rachel's hand in that exact way. It wasn't a trick they'd taught him. It wasn't part of his service training, and yet it was unmistakable. Ben told me about that, he said slowly. Said it was the one command he never wanted the army to take out of him. Rachel looked up at him, confused. You mean? I didn't get Zeus through a kennel. He came to me through the base, was assigned to me after Ben died. No one said where he came from, just that he'd been part of a different handler's plan. I thought it was a coincidence, but now, they both looked at the dog, who sat perfectly still, eyes watching them, ears relaxed. The weight of the realization passed between them like a living thing. Zeus had belonged to Ben. Caleb leaned back in his chair, his breath shaky. He's been with me ever since. I didn't know. I thought he was just a dog they assigned, but he always felt different. Rachel wiped a tear from her cheek. Maybe he never forgot. Maybe none of us did. They sat like that for a while, not speaking, just letting the magnitude of it settle. Then Rachel drew a long, shaking breath. I can't believe I ended up here, she said, with Ben's partner and his dog. Caleb shook his head. I don't believe in coincidence anymore. Evan stirred on the couch then, sitting up groggily. He blinked, looked around, then spotted his mother. She opened her arms and he patted over without a word, curling into her side. Zeus returned to the boy, licking his hand once before settling down at his feet again. Caleb stood. I need to make a call. Rachel looked up, brow creased. To who? A friend. Someone who might help. She looked like she wanted to protest, but something in his expression stopped her. Instead, she nodded. Caleb disappeared into the other room and came back 10 minutes later, slipping his phone into his back pocket. I have a contact. Veteran legal aid. If your brother really took that money, we might be able to get it back. Rachel blinked. But I don't have any proof. No statements, no contracts. I don't even have the paperwork he had me sign. Caleb's expression didn't change. Then we find it. She let out a breath. It's probably gone. I've moved so many times, left things behind in storage, I barely remember what I kept. Where's the last place you left anything? He asked. She thought for a moment. There's a facility in East Memphis, one of those cheap ones near the old mall. I had a unit there when we moved into a shelter, but we couldn't afford to keep it. I think they auctioned it off or dumped it. That was almost a year ago. Caleb looked thoughtful. Even if it's gone, it's a place to start. Rachel's jaw tightened. I don't want to get your hopes up. I'm not hoping, he said simply. I'm acting. Something about the way he said it left no room for argument. Later that day, Rachel watched Caleb kneel beside Evan and hand him a folded sweatshirt with the Marine Corps insignia stitched into the corner. Evan put it on without a word and looked up at him. Caleb ruffled the boy's hair. You wear that, you represent more than yourself. You represent someone who didn't come back. Make him proud. Evan gave a solemn nod. Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat. The past was still heavy, but the future, however uncertain, no longer seemed like a closed door. It was open now, just a crack, but open. And Caleb, for the first time in a long time, felt that he wasn't walking alone. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long amber shadows across the cracked asphalt of East Memphis. It was one of those afternoons where the warmth felt more like the leftover breath of a storm than the promise of a clear day. Caleb walked beside Rachel, his stride steady and purposeful. Evan walked between them, clutching a small battered toy car in one hand and holding onto the edge of his mother's jacket with the other. Zeus padded ahead, ears perked, tail swaying like a quiet metronome. The storage facility sat at the end of a long row of cinder-block buildings, just past an abandoned strip mall where pigeons had made nests in shattered shop windows. The gate creaked as they pushed it open. A few stray pieces of paper skittered across the lot, carried by a half-hearted wind. Everything about the place whispered of forgetfulness, the kind of place where things were left behind not just by accident, but by necessity. Rachel paused just inside the gate, her eyes sweeping over the rows of identical metal doors. Her face tightened with recognition, and Caleb saw her jaw clench. "It was down that way," she said, pointing toward the far end of the property. "Unit 317. At least, it used to be." Caleb nodded and led the way, stepping over a broken section of chain-link fence that had collapsed near the pavement. When they reached the unit, Rachel stared at the locked door for a moment before speaking. "They cleared it out after I missed 3 payments," she said softly. "I remember getting the notice. I cried for 2 days, not because of the stuff, really. We'd already lost most of what mattered, but I kept thinking maybe there was something in there I would need later. Turns out I was right." "Let's find the manager," Caleb said. They crossed back toward the small office near the front gate. A narrow building with a faded open sign in the window and a flickering fluorescent light overhead. The inside smelled like stale coffee and wet cardboard. A woman sat behind the counter, maybe in her early 50s, with tired eyes and a tight bun of red-dyed hair. She looked up as they entered, taking in the sight of the woman, the boy, the dog, and the man with military bearing. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice more curious than unfriendly. "We're looking for records," Caleb said, "from about a year ago, Unit 317. "Records?" Name was Rachel Myers. "The unit was cleared out, but we're hoping there might be some trace of where the contents ended up." The woman squinted at Rachel, then leaned back in her chair with a sigh. "Myers? Yeah, I remember that one. You had a kid with you back then, right?" Rachel nodded. The woman opened a drawer and pulled out a thick binder with plastic sleeves, flipping through handwritten notes and printed forms. After a few minutes, she tapped a page with her pen. "Here it is. Cleared on March 2nd last year. The contents were claimed by a donation partner, some local church-run resale place, not auctioned. Lucky you, I guess." "Do you know where it went?" Caleb asked. The woman turned and typed something into her old desktop computer, the keyboard clacking loudly. "Looks like it went to a donation site on Franklin Avenue. New Beginnings Outreach. It's a warehouse. They take overflow from shelters." "Thank you," Rachel said quickly, her voice breathless with hope. The woman waved her hand. "You're welcome. Hope you find what you're looking for." Outside again, they stood for a moment, the late sun catching in the puddles along the sidewalk. Rachel looked at Caleb, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't think we'd even get this far," she said. "We're not there yet," Caleb replied, already moving. New Beginnings. Outreach was a 15-minute drive across town, but without a car, they walked. Caleb kept his eyes on the road and Rachel's expression tight with tension. Evan, though tired, said nothing. He held Zeus's leash in his small hand now, and the dog walked calmly beside him, as if knowing the importance of the task. By the time they reached the warehouse, the sky had begun to fade into a lavender dusk. The building was unassuming, red brick with a painted sign and a chain securing the double doors. A side entrance led to a small reception area where a young man sat behind a desk listening to a radio. "We're closed," he said without looking up. Caleb stepped forward. "We're not here to shop. We're looking for a donation box. One dropped off from East Memphis Storage, Unit 317. Probably arrived last March." The man finally looked up. His eyes flicked from Caleb to Rachel, then to Evan and Zeus. Something in Caleb's stance, the calm authority, made the man sit straighter. Most stuff that comes in that way ends up unsorted in the back. If it's not tagged for resale, it just sits there. Volunteers go through it once a month or so. "Can we look?" Rachel asked. The man hesitated. "Technically, I'm not supposed to let people pass the desk after hours, but—" He looked at Caleb again and seemed to change his mind. "All right, I'll let you in, but you're on your own." He unlocked the side door to the warehouse and flipped on the overhead lights. Rows of tall metal shelves stretched into the distance, each stacked with bins, boxes, crates, and bags. The place smelled of old fabric, dust, and mothballs. A few overhead fans hummed weakly. Rachel stared at the sheer size of it all, her hope visibly dimming. "We'll start with the back," Caleb said. They split into rows. Rachel took one aisle, Caleb another. Evan stayed with Zeus, who sat at the edge of a row, tail twitching. Caleb scanned each label, flipping open boxes, glancing at the contents, mostly clothes, broken toys, old tools. Nothing marked, nothing organized. The hours passed slowly, the sky outside darkening to deep blue. Eventually, Caleb returned to the front of the warehouse. Rachel sat on an overturned milk crate, head in her hands, exhausted. Evan leaned against her leg, dozing. Zeus sat nearby, alert but quiet. "It's gone?" Rachel said, her voice hollow. "I knew this would happen." Caleb didn't respond. He glanced around one last time, scanning the shelves for anything different. Then Zeus stood up. The dog moved with sudden purpose, heading down a row Caleb hadn't checked yet. Caleb followed, uncertain. Zeus stopped at a stack of boxes in the corner, sniffed one, then pawed at it. A short, sharp bark rang out, startling the silence. Caleb moved quickly, knelt beside the box, and peeled back the flaps. Inside were faded baby clothes, a few picture frames, and, near the bottom, a water-stained envelope. Rachel rushed over, heart pounding. Caleb handed her the envelope. She opened it with shaking fingers. Inside were several documents: a signed agreement with her brother's name, a power of attorney form, and old bank statements showing transfers from Ben's military policy account. She stared, lips trembling. This is everything." Caleb sat back on his heels, relief washing over him. "Zeus," he whispered, reaching to stroke the dog's head. "Good boy." Rachel hugged the papers to her chest, tears falling freely now, not from loss, but from the sudden weight of justice within reach. That night, as they walked back through the city, no one spoke. Evan slept in his mother's arms. Caleb carried the envelope in his jacket, guarding it like a sacred artifact. Zeus walked beside them, ears alert, eyes forward, as if he knew the road wasn't over yet, but a battle had been won. And in Caleb's chest, where guilt had long made its home, something different stirred. Duty. Fulfilled. The next morning arrived with a quiet clarity that Caleb hadn't felt in years. The weight that had so long resided in his chest, silent and cold like old rust, had shifted. It hadn't disappeared, not entirely, but it had loosened, like a tightly bound knot finally given way. The envelope sat on the small dining table, dry now and carefully unfolded. Each paper inside was like a map, each line of ink leading directly toward the truth Rachel had feared she'd never be able to prove. Rachel sat beside the envelope with a look that bordered between disbelief and awe. Evan, in a fresh pair of clothes donated by a neighbor, sat on the floor, rolling his toy car in small circles. Zeus lay nearby, head resting on his paws, watching the boy with his usual quiet attentiveness. "You really think this is enough?" Rachel asked without lifting her eyes from the documents. "It's not just enough," Caleb said. "It's everything." He poured her a cup of coffee, his hand steady. She accepted it, still dazed. Outside, the air was crisp and clean, the memory of the storm finally fading. Inside, something had shifted between them all, something unspoken but deeply rooted. They were no longer strangers passing through each other's lives by accident. They had become part of a singular story now, one tied together by blood, loyalty, betrayal, and one dog's unshakable instinct. Caleb placed a call to Linda Brooks that morning, the same military legal advocate he'd contacted days earlier. Her voice on the line was firm, energetic, and immediately commanding. "You found what I think you did?" she asked, not even bothering with pleasantries. "Original contract, power of attorney transfer, several account statements," Caleb said, "all signed, clear paper trail." There was a pause on the line, and then a sharp exhale of breath. "That's gold," she said. "When can you get it to me?" "By noon." "I'll be ready." By 11, they were seated across from Linda in a small rented office near the courthouse downtown. She was a former Navy JAG with sharp eyes and a voice that sliced through hesitation like wire through paper. Her desk was stacked with folders, military plaques lined the walls, and a large thermos of black coffee steamed beside her laptop. Rachel sat stiffly, clutching her purse in her lap like a shield. Caleb stood beside her, arms crossed, and Zeus sat at his feet, as steady as ever. Linda took the document, scanned each page, and nodded slowly. When she reached the signature on the contract, Rachel's brother's name next to a scrawled date, she gave a tight smile. "This is what we needed. We'll file a formal claim this afternoon and initiate civil proceedings for theft and mismanagement of funds. There's a clause in the policy about next of kin fraud. He's not going to wiggle out of this." Rachel blinked, stunned. "So, what happens next?" Linda met her eyes. "We hit him hard and fast. With these documents, it won't even be a drawn-out case. This isn't about hearsay anymore. It's about paper, signatures, intent, and we've got it all." Caleb rested a hand on Rachel's shoulder. She exhaled, a little less shakily now. Evan sat in the corner of the room, playing quietly with a pad of sticky notes and a pencil, humming under his breath. Zeus occasionally looked over at him and then returned his gaze to Linda, almost as if assessing her credibility. That afternoon, Linda filed the paperwork. Within a week, the court scheduled a preliminary hearing. The speed of it startled Rachel. She had expected months, maybe years of slow bureaucracy. But when the documents were presented with precise organization and clarity, the system moved. Caleb's military precision in preparing the file had helped more than he admitted. When the hearing arrived, Rachel stood in the small courtroom beside Linda, her brother seated several feet away at the opposing table. He was older than she remembered, dressed in a suit too expensive for someone supposedly struggling to make ends meet. His expression when he saw her was carefully crafted, a smirk hiding behind indifference, as if her presence amused him. But when the judge began reading the list of documents submitted into evidence, the color drained from his face. The courtroom was quiet, except for the shuffle of paper and the occasional creak of wooden benches. Rachel didn't speak much. Linda did most of the talking. Her voice was crisp, authoritative, and impossible to ignore. She laid out the timeline, the deception, the forged trust agreements, the misdirected insurance payments, and the loss Rachel and Evan had endured. Rachel's brother tried to interrupt once, claiming it had all been a misunderstanding, that Rachel had verbally agreed to let him manage the funds, that she hadn't wanted the stress. Linda shot him down with a single question. If she didn't want the stress, why didn't you file a formal trust? Why weren't her son's interests documented in a binding legal arrangement? Why, if this was all above board, is there no record of your withdrawals being for his benefit? He had no answer. When it was over, the judge ruled in Rachel's favor. Not only was she awarded full control of the remaining funds, but her brother was ordered to pay restitution and damages. The number wasn't small. And while the legal process for enforcement would take time, the decision was clear. She had won. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining. Rachel stood on the front steps, stunned. Caleb watched her closely. She looked different. Not younger, not lighter, but somehow more solid, like someone whose foundation had finally been poured and dried beneath her feet. Evan stood beside Zeus, petting him and offering a cracker from his pocket. The dog accepted it politely, then leaned into the boy, pressing his head gently into Evan's chest the way he once had with Rachel. "He's the one who found the envelope," Rachel said, watching them. "If not for him, we'd still be lost." Caleb nodded. "He always had a good nose." "It's more than that," she said, her voice thick. "It's like he knew, like he was carrying the promise Ben never got to keep." They walked in silence for a time. People passed by without noticing them, without knowing what had just unfolded. But Caleb noticed everything. The way Rachel's spine had straightened. The way Evan held her hand, now not out of fear, but as a habit of love. The way Zeus walked slightly ahead, tail high, ears up, like a soldier leading the way. A few days later, the veteran community showed up in a way that surprised even Caleb. Word had spread about what had happened. Linda had passed the story along to a few colleagues, and from there, it had rippled outward. Old Army buddies, fellow medics, even a few retired officers Caleb hadn't spoken to in years offered help. Donations, support, furniture, contacts. Within days, they had secured a small apartment for Rachel and Evan in a quiet complex not far from Caleb's house. It wasn't large, but it was bright, safe, and came with 3 months' rent covered by an anonymous donor, though Caleb suspected he knew exactly who. On move-in day, a group of veterans showed up early, all in jeans and boots, carrying boxes and offering smiles that didn't come easily to men like them. They joked, argued over who got to carry the heaviest item, and treated the small apartment like sacred ground. Rachel looked at them in awe. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," one of them replied. "You're family." That afternoon, with sunlight streaming through the windows and Evan racing from room to room, Zeus flopped down on the new rug in the living room. Evan tackled him gently, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck, laughing. Zeus took it all in stride, tail thumping, eyes closed in contentment. Rachel stood in the doorway to the kitchen, watching them. Her face, once drawn and shadowed, was now lined with something brighter. Peace, maybe, or the beginning of it. Caleb watched from a few feet away, hands in his pockets, quiet. She turned to him. "I don't know how you knew," she said, "how you saw us under that bridge." "I didn't," he replied. "Zeus did." They both looked at the dog, now dozing as Evan lay across him like a living blanket. "I think he saw more than either of us ever could," she said. Caleb nodded. He didn't say that Zeus had saved him just as much as he'd saved them. That for years the dog had been his only anchor to the world. That every morning run, every quiet night, every nightmare softened by a gentle nudge, had been more than just routine. It had been survival. Now, watching Evan laugh, seeing Rachel smile, he understood something else. The promise he had made to Ben hadn't been a single moment. It had been a journey, and it had finally, fully been fulfilled, but not by him alone, by a team, one man, one woman, one boy, and one remarkable dog. There was a stillness in the air that morning, the kind that came only after long unrest, not the quiet of isolation or the hush before a storm, but the calm that followed when the dust had finally settled and the weight had lifted. The world, it seemed, had taken a deep breath and released it. And in the small, sun-warmed apartment on Cedar Grove Lane, something that had once been broken was slowly knitting itself back together. The move had been completed 2 days earlier, but it was only now, with the boxes unpacked and the furniture arranged, that the space began to feel like a home. Light spilled across the hardwood floors through open windows, carrying with it the sounds of birds and distant traffic. The scent of fresh paint lingered faintly, mingled with laundry detergent and something sweet from the kitchen. Banana bread, still warm in the oven. Rachel stood in the doorway between the living room and the small galley kitchen, one hand resting lightly on the door frame. She wore jeans and a cotton shirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her hair, still damp from a morning shower, hung loosely over her shoulders. There were faint circles under her eyes, but they no longer spoke of exhaustion. They told, instead of movement, effort, rebuilding, of life being lived again. In the living room, Evan sat cross-legged on the new blue rug, surrounded by colored pencils and the kind of oversized sketch pad kids always seem to fill in just a few days. He was drawing something. A house, it looked like, with a tree and a figure that might have been a dog. Zeus lay beside him, tail wagging slowly, ears twitching every now and then as if he were dreaming. Rachel smiled at the scene, then turned back to the stove to check the bread. When she pulled it out, steam rose from the golden crust, and the warm smell filled the apartment even more fully. She set it on the counter to cool, then leaned back, arms folded loosely, and exhaled. For the first time in what felt like years, there was no immediate danger, no ticking clock. She could cook something and not worry whether it would last the week. She could watch her son draw and not wonder how much longer he would have paper to use. She could take a deep breath and not feel like it might be the last one before the bottom dropped out again. It wasn't just the apartment, though the security of it meant more than she could express. It was what the place represented. The return of control, the possibility of stability, the reminder that she could protect her son after all. That she hadn't failed Ben, not entirely. That his legacy, his love, hadn't ended in a folded flag in a locked storage unit. It had found its way back through the most unexpected of messengers. A knock at the door broke the silence, light but firm. Rachel wiped her hands on a towel and crossed to open it. Caleb stood on the other side, holding a paper bag and wearing a clean white t-shirt and jeans, his boots slightly dusty. Zeus lifted his head, tail wagging harder now. "Brought something," Caleb said. Rachel stepped aside to let him in. "You've brought so much already." "This one's different," he said. "It's not mine." She raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. Evan looked up from the floor and grinned when he saw Caleb jumping to his feet and running over to hug his waist. Caleb returned the embrace with one arm and ruffled the boy's hair. "Zeus," Evan said excitedly, "I was drawing you. Want to see?" Zeus wagged his tail and stood, stretching before walking over to inspect the drawing with great interest, sniffing it carefully. Caleb handed Rachel the bag. "It's from Linda. Legal packet. Full transfer of all recovered funds. You're officially in control now." Rachel took the bag gently, staring down at it as if it held something holy. "And a few extras," he added. "There's a scholarship contact in there for Evan. Couple of folks from the unit started a donation drive. No pressure, just options." Her throat tightened. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already did." She blinked away sudden tears and stepped into the kitchen to set the bag on the counter. Caleb followed, leaning against the fridge. "How's it feel?" he asked. "Like I finally exhaled," she said. He nodded. "That's how it's supposed to feel." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of all that had happened hung between them, not as a burden now, but as a shared memory. They had walked through fire, not side by side exactly, but close enough to see each other in the smoke, and they had emerged, not untouched, but whole. "I think," Rachel said slowly, "you were sent to us. I used to believe in coincidence, but not anymore." "It wasn't me," Caleb replied. He looked toward the living room where Zeus now lay on his side, eyes closed as Evan drew a second dog beside the first. "He's the one who wouldn't walk past." Rachel smiled. He remembered. Caleb nodded. All this time he never forgot. Not Ben, not what mattered. She turned to face him fully. "And you?" He met her eyes. "I thought I had forgotten how to be a part of something, but watching you fight for Evan, seeing what you carried, what you risked to hold on, I remembered too." That night, the apartment glowed with warmth and laughter. A few neighbors stopped by to drop off small housewarming gifts, fresh towels, a potted plant, a set of dishes. Rachel accepted each one with grace and quiet gratitude. Caleb stayed through dinner, at Rachel's insistence, and Evan told him stories about his drawings, his plans for school, and how he wanted to train dogs just like Zeus when he grew up. As the evening waned, Caleb stood by the open window, sipping coffee from a borrowed mug. Rachel joined him, leaning on the sill. "It feels strange," she said, "knowing it's really over, that I'm not waiting for another shoe to drop." "It's not over," Caleb replied. "It's just beginning." She looked at him, then nodded. "Yeah, I think you're right." Zeus walked over and pressed his head gently into her leg, the same familiar gesture he had offered the first day beneath the bridge. She sank to the floor beside him and wrapped her arms around his neck. "You found us," she whispered. "You brought us home." Outside, the street was quiet. The world went on, indifferent and chaotic as always, but in that small corner of Memphis, something good had taken root. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the quiet triumph of survival, the steady beat of healing, the silent bond of trust that had begun with one dog's bark and ended with a promise kept. Later, after Evan was tucked into bed and the last plate had been washed, Caleb stood at the door, ready to leave. Rachel walked him out, her face lit softly by the porch light. "Will we see you tomorrow?" she asked. Caleb smiled. "You'll see us." Zeus gave a low, pleased woof as if confirming the plan, then trotted down the steps ahead of his partner. Rachel watched them disappear into the night, her heart no longer heavy but lifted. And for Caleb, as he walked home beneath a sky full of stars, something inside him had shifted for good. The weight of survivor's guilt that had once threatened to crush him had been replaced by something quieter, steadier. Pride. Not the kind born of accolades or medals, but the kind that lived in the knowledge that he had done what mattered. That he had stood by a promise, not out of duty alone, but out of love. That he had not just saved a life, but helped it begin again. And he hadn't done it alone. It had always been two of them. One man, one dog, one mission, complete. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more. Watch our next video now. Another powerful tale awaits. And please share this video with someone who believes in second chances.